Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. With Red Bull dominating the new regulations so far in the standings so far this season, some have wondered, can they potentially replicate the dominance Mercedes showed throughout the turbo hybrid era from 2014 through to 2021? Christian Horner says it's unlikely, but he would love to inflict the pain on Toto the Toto might have inflicted on him for the past decade or so. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you are new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. Really helps out the channel. Thank you very much indeed for doing that one. The numbers don't lie so far this season. Red Bull and Max Verstappen dominating both championships as it stands. Ferrari should have been their closest contender. Clearly the number one, number two cars as it stands, and also throughout the majority of the season. But arguably, Mercedes are favourites, you could say, to get P2 in the constructors. They're only about 35 or so points behind Ferrari, and they arguably have a better race car as it stands, with Ferrari falling off the pace from Red Bull a fair bit over the last few races. We'll see some of the numbers there in a second. And of course, most people would put their money on if there was one team that would be expected to challenge Red Bull next season, it might well be Mercedes more than it might be Ferrari. Ferrari, we know their reliability, their strategy hasn't been conducive to a world championship winning team. So many are kind of saying, well, look, if someone's going to end the Red Bull reign, it's only been a 1 year reign, but if there's a team that's going to do that, maybe Mercedes are the team to do that going into next season. And they're kind of focusing now really on next year's car. They have some further upgrades to bring for the next couple of races, but they're really intending those upgrades just to give them further understanding as to what this car concept can potentially do to then make their call on what they do in next year's car. Apparently they're kind of leaving all options on the table as to whether it looks like a Red Bull, a Ferrari, or whether it copies the Mercedes design from this year and tries to improve on its weaknesses, of which there are a fair few. So they realize Red Bull, they're way far ahead. Verstappen, I mean, it's not technically done as of recording the video, but yes, by Singapore, it's possible Verstappen could have locked up the drivers. The constructors will take a little bit of time, I think, to make it mathematically impossible, but Verstappen will more than likely win the drivers in Suzuka with 4 or 5 races to spare to the end of the season. So it's been a pretty dominant affair since around halfway through the year. And we can see that by the numbers, right? I thought this is rather interesting here from Formula Stats on Twitter, looking at the average race pace pre-Canada and post-Canada, right? So Canada, I think, was maybe the 9th race of the season. You guys can see here that in terms of the difference makers, Mercedes have probably made the most progress of the front runners. They went from about, almost a second back to about 3.5 tenths of a second over the last few races. Also, Aston Martin, good progress from them. Haas have effectively slipped backwards, as have AlphaTauri and Alfa Romeo, respectively, to the leaders. But in terms of race pace, Ferrari were the quickest car in the first few races. Now, Red Bull have been the quickest car in the most recent few races. And as we see, of course, Mercedes generally closing the gap since Canada. So, look, these numbers definitely show that Red Bull hasn't been a dominant car, certainly in terms of qualifying. But in the race, it's been the stronger car. It's been much better on its tyres in general, outside of Austria. And of course, with Verstappen behind the wheel and the great strategy team and reliability, they really haven't had any issues locking up these championships. Now, as even Helmut Marko says, right, Verstappen is approaching the level of dominance that Vettel showed in 2013, winning, 9 races in a row to the end of the season. Verstappen could potentially do 11 in a row to the end of the season and break that record. He's currently on 5. And, he could rack up some serious win numbers this season and maybe the next, depending on the way the regulations continue or don't continue to favour Red Bull. We saw, of course, when Mercedes arrived on the scene in 2014 with the new turbo hybrid era, they hit the ground running. They had the best car. They followed that advantage through for, of course, the entire era, really. There were, of course, some competitive years, when the Ferraris were good, but they always ended up on top. And some years they just had a car so far above and beyond what any other team was capable of achieving. Can Red Bull replicate this performance going forwards? That seems a very hard task to muster, but Verstappen is even in a position this season where he can break the record that Vettel currently holds of 155 points, the championship winning margin over Alonso. He can very much break that record if he continues his winning streak from now to the end of the season, right? Now, Christian Horner was kind of asked about this by Damon Hill. Like, what does he think about the possibility of dominating Formula 1 for years to come? Of course, Red Bull had that kind of 4-year period, 2009 or 2010, I guess it was, to 2013, when Vettel won 4 drivers' championships in a row. The Red Bull with the best car at the time. Then it goes into the new era. Mercedes dominate for the next several years. Now, a new set of regulations. Red Bull have started out on top yet again. So will they dominate the next several years? Horner reckons, look, it's extremely unlikely that the Red Bull will stay this good and this far ahead for the years to come, but he would, of course, say he'd love it to happen.
Mercedes dominated in the hybrid era, and these new regulations, you've got the jump on everybody. Are we going to see another 5-10 years of Red Bull dominating these new regulations?
Yeah, I can only wish. to inflict that amount of pain on Toto for the next 8 years, but it's highly unlikely. I mean, we've had a wonderful year so far. There's still a long way to go. Ferrari are quick, Mercedes are sorting themselves out, and you've got to keep looking forward, and all the lessons we learn now have to apply to next year as well.
So what do you guys think about that specific comment, right, about kind of inflicting that amount of pain on Toto? Mate, it's interesting, right? Because of course he's joking around to some extent, but I kind of doubt that he would say this unless he, obviously felt this to at least some degree, whether he feels like, the frustration of the turbo hybrid era since 2014, the kind of the pain that Toto Wolff has inflicted on him and Mercedes have inflicted on him, he would of course rather like to do the same thing back, I suppose. Which, look, I guess it makes sense at the end of the day. These guys are competitors. I'm sure Horner was incredibly frustrated throughout the last several years and was building up the smugness in his grin when, of course, Verstappen won the title, and now this year has been even better for them on the whole. But he does admit that continued dominance is unlikely. He says, look, Ferrari are quick, Mercedes are sorting themselves out, but which is the team most likely to challenge? Because I think there's a very feasible world in which Red Bull have, they've got a head start, right? They understand clearly the ground effect of the car and the ability to kind of set their car up for different circuits and be incredibly good. Obviously, their aerodynamics is incredibly good in terms of the reduction in drag they have, they're super quick in a straight line. They really nailed these regulations so far. They have a clear advantage in terms of they can potentially upgrade their car next year. Maybe Mercedes and Ferrari can get a car that's as good as their car was this season, but then maybe, Red Bull still have an advantage. So there's there's a world in which Red Bull still have the fastest car for a good, 2-3 years to come. And with Verstappen driving as he is, prime Verstappen, driving the best driver on the grid, it's going to be incredibly difficult to stop him and that team. So I think there's definitely a world in which Verstappen wins, 3-4 drivers' championships in a row here, kind of like what Vettel did, but dominance any longer than that is probably unprecedented and rather unlikely, with other teams that should eventually, given the advantages and the budget caps and the wind tunnel testing time that favours teams that are to the top of the championship, other teams theoretically should have the ability to catch up in future seasons. But this might continue for a little bit of time still to come. Unlikely for 8 years, as Horner says. But he definitely wants to inflict pain on Toto Wolff as much as is possible, which I thought was quite an interesting statement, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, definitely intrigued your thoughts in the comment section below. This I thought was interesting as well after that most recent victory at Monza, where Verstappen had never taken a podium before. He now has podiums at 30 of the 31 circuits where he has ever raced. I believe the only driver to have more podiums than this at different tracks is Lewis Hamilton, I believe. And the only circuit he hasn't had a podium at is actually Mugello, where we might return in the future or might not, who really knows. So intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. A couple of things to close out the video here with. This is from Casper's Wart here on the Reddit. I thought was a really cool little idea, putting together a World Cup that could potentially be done in the off-season or something in equal cars, or I don't really know. Of course, the Dutch team, Verstappen, Nick de Vries, Sainz, Alonso from Spain, Vettel, Mick Schumacher from Germany, Perez, Award from Mexico could be kind of cool. Hosted in Qatar, I suppose, alongside this year's World Cup, and then the Australian guys, Riccardo and Piastri, Bottas, Raikkonen would be quite the pairing, Norris, Van Dorn, Hamilton, Russell, of course, from England, Gasly, Ocon, which is more than likely going to be the Alpine lineup next season as it stands. And then some kind of honourable mentions here from Brazil, the Leclerc brothers from Monaco, of course, Tsunoda and Iwasa would be a kind of a nice pairing. Canada, of course, as well, Stroll and Latifi, interesting pairing to say the least, to be honest. And then, of course, some other countries worthy of note as well. But very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you are new, take care, and I'll see you next time.